You are the generation in this very moment that could sort everything out. And you'll also be the generation that will know you could have done that and didn't later on. And if that doesn't switch a whole load of new people who aren't currently on board into doing something, then I honestly don't know what will.
Welcome to the ClimateGenn podcast. In this episode, I'm speaking with Nick Oldridge, co-organiser of the National Emergency Briefing at Westminster Central Hall. On the 27th of November, MPs and key leaders will gather for the science-led update on climate and nature that every UK citizen deserves. In Nick's words,
we're essentially holding the official briefing that we believe the government should be holding. We are going to be briefing on the climate and nature crisis, but on a very broad scope, so covering all the issues that need to be on the table when you have this conversation.
You'll hear why such a broad, expert-led session is essential right now, how it directly combats misinformation, and why supporting it is one of the most potent things any one of us can do, not just for the planet, but for Britain's future.
So when my MP comes along and says, here's my new climate policy, I can say, well, no, I saw you hear those words from that climate scientist. I know what you know, so can we do something that's relative to the situation and commensurate with the risks we face?
In the next episode, I'll be publishing the interview with XR co-founder Claire Farrell, recorded in Helsinki 2 weeks ago after Dr. James Hansen delivered his keynote speech. Interviews with Baroness Natalie Bennett discussing her book, Change Everything, and with Dr. Ian Stevens, based at the Geological Survey of Denmark and Greenland, who sheds light on the transient but persistent lives of these mysterious microbes thriving on the ice. The uncut versions of these are already in the members area, and more interviews are being recorded. Thank you to all members and for everyone who comments, likes and shares. It's much appreciated. Nick, it's great to see you. Thank you very much for taking the time. And I'm also extremely excited about your forthcoming event, the National Emergency Briefing. Can you start by just telling us what it is and why now?
Okay, well, thanks for having me. So the National Emergency Briefing is going to take place on the 27th of November in Westminster Central Hall. And we're essentially holding the official briefing that we believe the government should be holding. So hence some of the style and the sort of way we're presenting this is leaning into that official nature. And we are going to be briefing on the climate and nature crisis, but on a very broad scope, so covering all the issues that need to be on the table when you have this conversation. So I think a lot of climate communication tends to be about just nature, or it tends to be about just atmospheric, CO2 levels, that kind of thing. This is everything on the table. And the intended audience is as many politicians as we can corral into attending, along with leaders from business, culture, faith, and the media. So if you like, it's like trying to bring together a national moment to have a conversation on something, a little like we did in COVID. And I know COVID's got its issues, but we're talking about science here that's more settled than that. But what was interesting about COVID was that we all sat up and listened, didn't we? There was suddenly a moment when we took notice. And critically, we were listening directly to experts saying these words to us. And that's where the power lies. Another element that's really key to me is the kind of bearing witness. So you want the MPs to be briefed, but the idea that collectively we're witnessing them being briefed. We'll come to how we disseminate this outwardly later. And for me, that's really powerful. So when my MP comes along and says, here's my new climate policy, I can say, well, no, I saw you hear those words from that climate scientist. I know what you know, so can we now be a bit more can we do something that's relative to the situation and commensurate with the risks we face? And so that's another powerful element. And the important factor is who the hell's Nick and who are behind it. And so the project was actually conceived by my brother, Simon Oldridge. We both work on climate. We used to run a business together. So we became climate aware at the same time, if you like. We were manufacturing using lots of gas. early 2000s, and there were lots of conversations, effectively you won't be able to do that in the future in carbon taxes and carbon trading. And the Stern report was that mid 2000s. So we became very aware of this looming threat probably quite early, and it sort of developed from then. And it's interesting at that point, 1%, 2% cuts would have covered it. So you assume that it will just happen behind the scenes, and then you arrive to the now and you realize it's not. So Simon, who'd been campaigning with Zero Hour and various other campaign groups, came up with this idea of a COVID style briefing. I was busy doing climate science breakthrough, so uniting comedians and climate scientists as a way of cutting through. And it suddenly felt that our work seemed to be converging because we're trying to get these experts that we talk about so regularly, we're trying to connect them with the culture, with politics, with people. And it was when he said to me, do you know, I think I'm going to hire Westminster Central Hall. I decided, okay, I'm in. So we're now doing this as a joint venture, and my co-founders from Climate Science Breakthrough, the creative force behind that are part of this, and it's a wider team as well. As for the why, people listening to this podcast will know the why, but from my perspective, climate's slipping down the agenda, isn't it? It reached kind of top of the list. Was it 2019, 2021? And it's slipping down, and there are lots of reasons why it might do that. And I think that's in part the vested interests and their success in saying these solutions are expensive, they'll cost you personally money, and they don't really work properly, and they compete with food, and we've got all these other worries. Oh, and by the way, we've got this great thing called CCS, so you don't need to worry about anything because we can just plug it in and everything will be fine. But there's also the kind of backslapping that's going on in the UK about, we've got these fantastic targets, and they were initially, but they're not now. And we've done this great emissions reduction process, over 50%, which really I find problematic because you're not being straight with the public. We're not including aviation, we're not including DRACs, we're not including imports. Oh, by the way, we offshored more of our manufacturing than most industrial nations, at least, didn't we? And we shifted to gas, which was great, but we're not quite publishing the figures on gas because all that upstream methane leakage, we're not going to talk about that. So, when you strip out the things we don't include, it's less than 1% a year. And when you look ahead, we're not really going anywhere. So there's another reason to take us out of this kind of like, well, we're all right, aren't we? And by the way, our emissions don't really count anyway. The other one is a lack of information. So I don't know whether you find this when you've come across someone in your personal life or in your work life who is suddenly crossing that threshold into climate and saying, I think I need to get my head around this. This is probably worse than I previously anticipated or thought. I don't know where to send them because you've got screaming, overly scary headlines on the one hand, and then you've got super complicated, very technical, deep, long, boring reports on the other hand. I mean, I remember trying to share the Chatham House report, was it 2021, with people. It was 400 pages long. It was something about all the risks combined. So that doesn't work. So the output of this event, it won't just be the moment of the event. The output of the event will be we've got these 8 talks, which we'll come to, but we're going to have those as effective library. So someone can go to one source and work their way through in very concise terms with enough of the science, but without too much of the science, and framed in the right way that works for the public. And they can work through this information and get their heads around it. And I think that's a really missing piece of the jigsaw. And the final one, maybe Zach Polanski's starting to change this, but we don't really have anyone walking around with a vision of what tackling climate change looks like. And we've got all these extraordinary gains on the table in terms of our health, national security, economic security. I mean, the payback alone, I found this point mind-blowing from the Climate Change Committee, 37 billion a year and growing once we get to that point where we've decarbonised the system. I mean, what a payback. It seems extraordinary, but no one's telling that story. So that's effectively what we're trying to do.
Well, this came out in a previous interview. The climate change, we've always treated it as this one issue, and we talk about these very, very scientific markers or pointers, if you like. But really, it's a component of every area now, and we don't talk enough about that, which actually sort of impacts everybody. Looking at the experts, you've mentioned the areas, how you've sort of divided up the expertises. And they're very pragmatic. They're not the alarmist, let's just look at the Arctic or something like that. There's food, national security, energy, weather extremes and so on. You've got economics. I just wanted to know, what have you learned from the sort of previous? You mentioned the climate science breakthrough and Simon's work with Zero Hour. How have those campaigns, do you find that you come with these sort of resources that you can feed into putting this together?
I think when you spend so much time at the interface of the science, the politics, culture, then I think you do absorb it. And I think it's really unfair on these experts to say they're responsible for doing all the research, all the understanding, all that credibility, all that, incredible hard work, and then somehow managing to package it up and frame it in the right way that not only the public can digest, but that counters all the maneuvers by the vested interests and the columnists and the people that just like to, throw mud at things. So broadly, yes. So much climate information I see is very specific. So that was one thing we felt was certain. It's a bit like the moment when you capture someone. I mentioned earlier, someone becoming climate aware. When you capture someone in that moment and you try and sweep everything together, you don't go into 20 minutes just on biodiversity loss, or you don't go into just extreme weather, because you're going to leave them thinking it's a singular problem and it's going to get quite technical. I think so many Brits assume that's an overseas thing that happens in faraway places, for one, and I think they also assume in time. It's quite a long way away in time as well. So it's not as serious as you think. It's happening in the future, and it's happening far away. You read the Institute of Actuaries reports and some of the content in all these talks, and it's so visceral. But for me, the reason why Climate Science Translated started was watching Kevin Anderson do one of his really powerful pieces to camera, and it looked like my son had shot it at uni on his phone and sent it to me. And so here's a gentleman, a scientist, a professor, saying that the most important message on the planet, as far as I'm concerned, right now, why has it got this treatment? Why does it look like it's at a fringe event that no one took any care in sort of how it was presented? And that was the premise for me. Finding it didn't come from me; it came from my creative partners. A creative way of allowing that to penetrate, and in a way, this is the same thing. Bring them to Westminster Central Hall, which is where the first ever UN meeting took place in 1946. And we like pageantry and these kind of things in Britain, don't we? So you've got the sense of importance, and then fill it with all the people that kind of need an update. I'm not frustrated with politicians. Think about the things that will be on your agenda right now to worry about. And so unless you hear directly from these same people, you're not going to suddenly push climate up the agenda.
You mentioned, the people who get to that point where they're looking for information, but there's also the point before that where they're almost being blocked out. And one of the reasons is obviously there's a sort of opposing narrative. And can you highlight some of the common misconceptions that you've heard from, it could be from MPs, from leaders, business leaders, about net zero, which seems to have fallen into the crosshairs recently and actually does dissuade people from wanting to be on board?
It's interesting because they're getting sort of posted on my LinkedIn at the moment as people say, I've written to my MP, here's the reasons why they're not coming. So that's proving to be quite useful. I mean, the classic is 1% of emissions, isn't it? And I'm not a sort of expert on this, but okay, well, it's a cumulative problem. It stays in the atmosphere for a long, long time. So you can't go on the annual figure. You have to go on the historical figure. And we're about fifth. So nearly every country on the planet has emitted less than us. And it's still maybe only 2%. But I really love that Hannah Ritchie way of if you take all the countries that are 2% and less and sweep them up into a block, that's the biggest block. I think it's 36% of total emissions, more than the US, more than... There's great ways to push back on that. And I think Carbon Brief did a great piece on if you take it per capita and if you add our colonial territories when they were under our responsibility only and only then, and measuring it per capita, we are number 2 biggest emitter on the planet after the Dutch, funnily enough. But you've got all these countering points, but they live on the fringes of social media, don't they? You won't watch Sunday Politics or Question Time or something and hear someone pour scorn like, our emissions don't matter, and throw that into the mix, and you won't hear a coherent countering response. So that's one really important thing that we're trying to work on. I think another common misconception is the money, and we are in a dire financial position, and it makes sense to think that why would we, under any circumstances, want to spend 300 billion on something that people say doesn't work properly? And this is where that climate change committee figure is so powerful. And again, it's not used in common panel discussions and interviews. So they've got a problem with that too. So I think the other side are just very good. They're very good at simple messaging. They're very good at working collaboratively. And I think people who are pushing climate, but also climate justice, social justice, inequality, we're all working in little silos. And so we don't have the kind of spokespeople who seem to be successfully working the right. So that the messaging's all got a bit lost, I think.
You are really facing as well, I think, this sort of barrage of misinformation. And we have these organizations that seem to be coming over from the US whose mission seems to be to mislead the public on these specific issues, things like net zero. Is the national emergency briefing an effort to counter this? And do you see in the work you're doing a sort of strategy to push back on that?
Absolutely. So our experts are currently putting their talks forward, and we are very politely and humbly applying that lens to add to the talk and try and get the framing right to specifically counter some of this information. So what you hear will be completely authentically driven by the expert. We're just making sure that we position it in the right way to assist people who've had a head full of very, very different information. And so that certainly is something we're trying to do. In terms of ongoing strategy, I guess one thing our chair, Mike Berners-Lee, says, which is very powerful, is when he does talks to people, he wants to take them through a one-way gate. So he's going to go through this conversation, and it's going to be difficult at times, and we can come to how we structure that, but essentially you do the difficult stuff at the beginning and you finish on the positive, and that is the climate story. It's got brutal truths in it and it's got amazing positives. But when they've been on through that sort of arc, they're never going to be the same again. And this one-way gate idea means that from that point on, we are hopefully filling society, and these are people with influence in the room, hopefully, filling society with people who've now made that leap. And so when the misinformation lands in all the places it lands, whether it's the press, whether it's in a dinner party conversation, whether it's on a panel discussion on television, you've got people equipped. They don't have to be experts, but they're equipped to know, hang on a minute, I've had a briefing and I'm a little more up to date now, so I can counter some of this. But there's a next step. So the briefing is the top-down moment, and we're going to film it, and we're going to make a film of the event. It won't simply just be all the talks stitched together in a film. That wouldn't have to, not being present in the room, you wouldn't have the same atmosphere. But we're going to have clips of the talks, and we're going to link that in with reactions of people who are there. And so that will be very normal people and hopefully some more well-known people. I think it's very important when you see someone who you recognize, know, and trust have a bit of a moment. That's how you shift social norms, basically. If you see someone who is a known figure, I'm not going to name any yet because we haven't nailed that down. A known figure, say, Christ Almighty, I didn't quite realise it was that serious, but equally I didn't realise that we had all these routes that we could take, all these pathways. I don't like the word solutions, but effectively solutions to solve it, and life could actually be better. I know, obviously, it will still be a warmer climate, but there's so much positivity there. So the film will be around 30, 40 minutes long. And what we want to do with that going into next year is use it as a grassroots campaign. So the film can be shown in village halls, town halls. I mean, the National Trust are interested in showing it. One of our partners, the Church of England, have suggested maybe we could show it in our cathedral, which is quite interesting. But effectively, it's for people to convene, watch the film, but invite their MP, invite anyone who is in the local community who is in any of the sciences that are covered or the expertise that are covered in the film, and then have a discussion from there. So if you like, the event is the big grand national moment, societal moment we're trying to create, and then next year the film will do its rounds and hopefully percolate through on a grassroots level and make it very difficult for MPs to then say, well, I saw that event, but I'm now going to dismiss it because it will keep coming back round again. So that's how we, I suppose, stop it being a one-off moment, and then we allow the other side to quickly move in and try and unpick all the messaging. It'll keep returning, basically, and it'll come from community-driven action, grassroots, people doing it in their own communities.
Yeah, and there is a sort of dimension at the moment that society really is polarized on so many different things. So there's a unifying, a unifying task to be done. Do you feel that you can overcome some of these divisions in society with environmental messaging, which is kind of overall messaging is in disarray at the moment?
Hopefully, we're going to be putting a lot of time and effort into that. I mean, we already know the majority of people concerned, don't we? So we've already got, if you like, we're already kind of unified in our concern. I think where we split is, okay, what do we do and what's the priority? And I think what people don't like is when life is tough, the cost of living is their number one priority. Someone saying we've got to spend money on something else, and it's seen as fringe. And I don't know whether you get this, but people often say to me, "Oh, you're very passionate. That's something you're very passionate about, Nick, isn't it? The climate." And so it's seen as an abstract, distant thing. And I think when you bring people together and say, "No, this isn't about coral reefs, butterflies, polar bears, far away, but this is us. This is about us." And about our security. And so Lieutenant General Richard Nugent being there to cover national security. That's the kind of way you get the message to land with someone who finds, all this eco stuff a little bit woolly. Same with health. Hugh Montgomery, when he stands up and presents a picture of the NHS completely disintegrating. Well, I think we're all unified in loving the NHS, aren't we? So again, another way of pulling things together. Same with Paul Berens, Professor Paul Berens, who you had on. Look at what happened in COVID and toilet rolls. Those food shortages, I often try and imagine how they play out. Do you have rationing? Do the supermarkets give you a slot or an amount you're allowed to take away? So when you bring those conversations in, it suddenly makes it completely about your life and the here and now. And so I think that will bring people together. And then there's the other one, like, how expensive life is at the moment. Well, there's this kind of other way of operating an economy. Do you remember that meta study about the $12 trillion we save in a decarbonized world? Again, it all sounds abstract, doesn't it? But there's a better way, and no one's got this positive vision of this better way. So hopefully there's some of that. But a final one on this, when they have those climate citizens' assemblies, this polarized society of ours seems to suddenly come together at that point, doesn't it? When they hear directly from experts and they all sit around together and work out, routes to solving this. The evidence I've read sounds quite cohesive. It sounds like it's pulling people together.
One of the things that particularly excited me in a way is the fact that when you look back over a timeline, and let's just go to Paris, for example, there was this sort of feeling that we'd made a bit of progress, that the powers that be were going to do something. We've gone forward 10 years and it really is complete disarray. And the science is really, really, really tough if you start looking into it. And it feels at the moment that we're on the back foot in trying to communicate these things. And this is a sort of, I'm not going to say last ditch attempt, but it's urgently needed and we shouldn't take it very lightly at all. Where do you go from here if it doesn't get the traction that you anticipate? What's your sort of like I don't know, a plan B if it doesn't resonate the way that we need it to?
I'll come in from a personal level. So I funded Climate Science Breakthrough initially, and the only way I got to that point, lucky privileged me. I'm in a position where I could do that, but the only way I got to that point was I imagined me in, I don't know, 2040, some date in the future. I'm watching everything sort of disintegrating, and I'm not being overly dramatic. I'm just going off, the Institute of Actuaries and people like that. And I just try to lean into or try to feel or imagine what the sense of frustration would be. And the point is, it's a terrible problem, but I wouldn't be doing this if we didn't have some incredible solutions. I mean, Paul Berens would have talked about, shifting diet and then basically saving nature from freeing up all this land. They're really evocative, some of these solutions, the routes that we could go on. But they're all time limited. They're only on offer now. If we roll forward 15, 20 years, as things start to fray, we'll be using so many of our resources to try and firefight and to try and fight populism and to stop the political discourse descending as, the refuge migration, comes in some serious numbers. So it's a real here and now moment. So I'm really hoping that by having all those people in that room at the same time and sort of wrapping this all up in that way, You are the generation in this very moment that could sort everything out. And you'll also be the generation that will know you could have done that and didn't later on. And if that doesn't switch a whole load of new people who aren't currently on board into doing something, then I honestly don't know what will. So yes, I'm banking on success. Is I suppose is the overall answer, but it isn't just UK centric. I suppose we've got interest of very early interest of national emergency briefing being something that would transport into other countries. So if it doesn't completely land here, someone will pick it up and do it better in another territory. So that could be a way of ensuring a legacy of some sort.
On the positive side, if it does work out well, are you thinking of something that could be annualized so that you sort of do more of it in a way? Because this is a
Yes, I mean
moving.
we've got these recommendations to the government. We've purposely not gone into policy because I think everyone in the climate space has got their own mission, and we didn't want to compete with that. We're just trying to convene and create that moment where all the other NGOs and charities working can use our moment to push their work further. So if you're in zero hour, you can then build on this as a reason for supporting the climate and nature bill. But one of the recommendations is this briefing is held again for the MPs who were not present, and that it's held annually. Who knows if the government have got a severe number of problems to be worried about, but putting that on the table is quite powerful. Yeah, so seeing more of this, but I think seeing it happen in other places, in other countries, will be very, very powerful.
Well, politicians are busy and they have a lot on their plate. But as we said at the sort of outset, this does feed into absolutely every single policy area they're looking at. So hopefully they do, see the value in what you're doing. And you kind of answered my last question anyway on the best case positive outcome. So I'm just going to ask you if you're in the UK as a listener, what's your call to action for them?
So in terms of a call to action, yeah, this is a game of lobbying your MP. So we have 85 parliamentarians confirmed so far to attend the event, including Neil Kinnock. Lord Kinnock is coming. It's a good old list developing, but we need as many as possible. Obviously, we're not going to get 650. And the way that happens is for people to email their MP. And it's quite a simple process. You go on our website, nebriefing.org, and we have a postcode checker. You drop in your postcode, and it will tell you very swiftly whether your MP is or is not coming. If they're not, there's a process of emailing them. And I would just say, try and write something from yourself that's original. Email spam filters, particularly for parliamentarians, seem to be quite powerful. So you simply just stick in standard messages. Well, we're hoping that if the MP gets one or two of those from the committed climate campaigner in their constituency, that probably won't do it. But if they get 20, 30, 40, that's really going to make an impact. And I'm hoping this will be elevated because I can tell you that we've got Chris Packham opening the event now, and he's going to be making that announcement very, very soon. So hopefully that will add some fresh energy into this desire to call on MPs. But I do sympathise with people out there writing to your MP, and I've done it many times. Seems quite a benign act, but this putting our MPs in this room to listen to this briefing, I think, is probably one of the most potent things you can do as someone who wants change. Actually, not just on climate and nature, is it? It's on the future. This could bring us as so many other residual benefits as well. So yes, check out the website, drop in your postcode, and please email your MP.
Well, Nick, thank you very much. It's been really interesting and insightful, and I really do hope it's a big success. And I look forward to sort of being at the briefing myself and really, reporting on it and trying to get the message out. So thanks a lot.
Fantastic, and thank you for having me. It's been great.
If you are concerned about the future, then why not travel with me through every COP conference from COP21 in Paris to COP28 in Dubai by ordering my book, COP Out: How Governments Have Failed the People on Climate. In COP Out, you'll gain insights into what is actually going on in these supposed world-saving conferences and how we have ended up in this dire era of dangerous consequences. You can order COP Out via the link in the notes or on any online bookstore worldwide in paperback or audio version.